Well, good evening everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. My name is Councillor Gary Thompson and I'm the chair of this committee. The Local Government Act 2020 enables council to hold virtual meetings for councillors participating remotely by electronic communication. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on the council website to enable public viewing of the proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the council website as soon as practically possible after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered tonight by the committee, then the meeting will be adjourned until resolution. However, council is not responsible for any technical difficulties that may be experienced by a member of the community in participating remotely in this meeting. Once the meeting commences, there will only be limited assistance that can be provided. I acknowledge that all councillors are present and on the screen for tonight's meeting. There are also a number of other officers in attendance who will be introduced when presenting their reports. The purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. The committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which includes a summary of the objections received. Tonight, we will be facilitating public submissions by electronic means of communication to hear from members of the community. I will call upon you individually when it is time to make your submission, and you'll be placed into your meeting to present your submission. I'll also just foreshadow who the next speaker is as well, so you can prepare yourself. When making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the officer's recommendation. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep your submissions focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. Importantly, focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or details in the officer's report. If you are opposed to the officer's recommendation, please tell the committee why and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. There is a strict limit of 3 minutes for every speaker. Whilst as chairperson, I reserve the right to vary that time, I seldom do. And with 9 speakers this evening, I'll be keeping to the 3 minutes. So at the 2.5 minute mark, I will announce that you have 30 seconds to conclude and wrap up your presentation. Moving now on to the order of business. Ms. Tyler, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there are no apologies this evening.
Thank you. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 7th of February 2022. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to move and adopt. I've got Councillor Park as mover and second to Councillor Hollingsworth. Is there any opposition on that item? There being none, I will put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. Move on to item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any conflicts of interest this evening? There appears to be no conflicts of interest. Councillors, are there any concerns with the order of business set out in the agenda from here forward? If there is none, then I'll proceed to item 3.1 of the business papers. So item 3.1 is Rosebery Street, Hawthorne East, the Heritage Assessment. Before I move to the reporting officer this evening, I'd like to notify councillors present that a Change.org online petition was received by council over the weekend for Rosebery Street to be recognised as a heritage street. For the benefit of the petitioners, many of whom may be watching tonight, I'm acknowledging that officers have received your petition and this will be tabled in accordance with our governance rules at a future council meeting. So we'll move to the officers' report, which will be introduced by Mr. Robert Costello, Principal Strategic Planner.
Thank you, Chair. This report considers the advice provided by GML Heritage and Extend Heritage in response to the further written evidence provided by interested community members to support a community nomination to include properties in Rosebery Street, Hawthorn East in the Heritage Overlay. This follows the consideration of a previous report on the matter on 4th of October 2021. Officers would like to acknowledge the effort put in by interested community members through the community nomination and the compiling of documents supporting the nomination, including the professional heritage advice received. The advice from Extent Heritage is provided at attachment 1 to the report, and the advice from GML Heritage is provided at attachment 2. After reviewing and considering the additional documentary evidence submitted by community members, including a heritage report by Nigel Lewis, both consultants maintained their position there is no justification to include Rosebery Street or part thereof in the Heritage Overlay, either as a standalone precinct or an extension to the existing Brickfields Environs precinct. Extent Heritage has reiterated their early advice the built form in Rosebery Street does not meet the threshold under the planning practice note to justify inclusion in the Heritage Overlay in full or in part. This is due to low intactness of the built form in the street. GML Heritage has found there is no strategic justification to include properties in Rosebery Street in the Heritage Overlay according to the criteria used to apply the Heritage Overlay to the Brickfields Environs precinct. GML Heritage notes the only potential basis for including properties in Rosebery Street in the Heritage Overlay is a review and update of the existing citation and statement of significance for the Brickfields Environs precinct to identify the late 19th century era of the Fritsch-Holzer brickworks when Hawthorn black bricks were being manufactured as the most important era of significance. This would require the preparation of a new citation, a review of all gradings of existing properties in the newly created Brickfields Environs precinct, the preparation of a new statement of significance, and the initiation of a new planning scheme amendment process, which typically lasts at least 2 years. Restarting this process would raise a number of significant risks that Council needs to consider and could result in an overall reduction in heritage protections for the Brickfields Environs precinct. These risks are as follows. Risk 1, limiting the period of significance to the period when the Hawthorn black bricks were produced at the factory in the late 19th century means properties from other periods, early Victorian, Edwardian and interwar, face the risk of being downgraded to non-contributory or removed from the precinct entirely. The loss of houses from other periods might threaten the overall viability of the precinct if insufficient late 19th century development remains in a contiguous form. Risk number 2, the impact on the community of the Brickfields Environs precinct of taking them back through the 2-year process and potential uncertainty and stress that some community members may experience. Risk 3, risks of property owners in the precinct again challenging their heritage grading through a new process or new challenges arising that were not previously considered or decisions made by the Minister for Planning resulting in a loss of existing properties from the precinct. And the final risk 4, continued risk that properties in Rosebery Street may still not be considered worthy of heritage protection even with a new citation due to lack of consistent built form intactness in the street. For the reasons above, restarting the planning scheme amendment process for the Brickfields Environs precinct to try to justify the inclusion of Rosebery Street is not recommended. The officer recommendation is to take no further action. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. And councillors, this evening we have 9 people who've indicated they wish to make a presentation on this item. There are 8 opposed and 1 for the officer's recommendation. Once I've announced your name, a member of the governance team will enable access to the meeting so that you can make your submission. If a submitter is not present whilst their name is called out or a submitter experiences technical issues, we'll move on to the next speaker. Once all speakers have made their submission, we'll attempt to come back and hear from anyone who experienced technical difficulties. I just remind all submitters that there's a strict time limit of 3 minutes, and I'll be giving you a 30-second warning at 2.5 minutes just to wrap up your presentation. Please commence the submission with your name and the suburb and whether you are in support or against the officer's recommendation. So our first speaker this evening is Mr. Domenico Boffa, and following Mr. Boffa will be Ms. Nerida Muirden.
My name, can you hear me?
We can, Mr. Boffa. Thank you. Please commence with your presentation.
Yeah. My name's Dominic Buffer and I live in Rosebery Street, and I'm opposed. My family and I, as a 21-year-old, moved into Rosebery Street in 1A Rosebery Street in 1968, and in 1982, I purchased number 1 Rosebery Street and became a ratepayer. In 54 years, I've seen many changes in the area, some good, some not so good. I lived through the closing of the brickworks, the demolishing of the chimney and the office buildings, and people losing their backyards. The site was used for many years as a tip. The pollution that came from the tip and the mosquito-infested pond that came about because of the underground spring at the east end of Bowler Street, and finally the park it is now. I acknowledge the work that our group has been able to do and the information we've been able to supply in relation to Rosebery Street and the brickworks. We're talking about 150 years of history. I'm sure there is a lot more information that sits in the archives of the Hawthorn City Council. As a ratepayer and concerned citizens, we should be given the time to explore and investigate the 150 years of history. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, and we should be allowed to do it with the help of the council, the councillors and the planning department. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, a number of historical homes and beautiful gardens and architecture were destroyed to make way for flats and apartments. Auburn Grove is a classic example of this, and there are many streets around Hawthorn that are the same. We'll never know how much history was destroyed, and now we've left with a legacy of hundreds or even thousands of flats that have become eyesores. Back to Rosebery Street. The demolishing continues. The houses that have been demolished and what's replaced them is totally out of character within the street. For example, houses number 53, 66 and 85. Every last millimetre of land has been used with very little garden, no trees. If we don't protect the houses in Rosebery Street, within the next 10 to 15 years, they will go into landfill and their history destroyed forever. There is a way to protect Rosebery Street if we focus on the park's history and consider protecting the park. This has been stated in the council's consultant report. In years to come, as we walk down Rosebery Street, when many of the houses are all gone, maybe we'll think we should have tried harder to save the houses. I ask all of you, please help us save the houses in Rosebery Street, and will be well worth it. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Mr. Buffer. Well done with your timing, by the way. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr. Buffer? We do have a question, Mr. Buffer. It's from Councillor Stavro.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Buffer, for your presentation. Look, one question that I have of you, and you may or may not know the answer to this, is, and pardon me for being a little bit forward here, I think that your background is from the Mediterranean background, and there was a number of migrants from the Mediterranean that came in the 50s and 60s. Are you aware of any connection of the Mediterranean migrants that perhaps would have worked at the brickworks that were living around the Rosebery Street at all?
Not in answer to your question, not that I'm aware of, but I think that's something that, if given the opportunity, that might come up as a part of the history. When we go back through the archives of the Hawthorn City Council, we could possibly find that. So that's why I'm asking that we need more time. There's 150 years of history and we need time to look into it.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stavro. Are there any other further questions, councillors? There appears to be none. Thank you, Mr. Boffa, for your presentation this evening.
Thank you.
We'll call up our second speaker, Ms. Nerida Murden, and this will be followed by Mr. Darren Simcox following Ms. Murden. Good evening, Ms. Murden. If we can just commence with your name and suburb and your presentation.
Firstly, can you hear me and see me okay?
We can, thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay. Hi. My name is Nerida Murden and I live in Camberwell. Good evening and thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'd also like to thank the officers and councillors for continuing to look into the protection for Rosebery Street, Hawthorn East. However, I do oppose the officer's recommendation. Tonight, I'm speaking about the Heritage Consultants Report. The Friends of Rosebery Street group engaged heritage expert Nigel Lewis to look into Rosebery Street to do a report about its heritage value and importance in relation to the Fritz Holzer brickworks, now known as the Fritz Holzer Park. Mr. Lewis's report states the importance of the brickworks to Melbourne. Some quotes from his report are, the Fritz Holzer Park is significant for the Fritz Holzer clay pit landform, one of the largest serving in Melbourne, and the bluestone drain behind Rosebery Street houses. The late 1800s period was very important for Fritz Holzer when they produced a range of coloured bricks with a distinctive hawthorn black as their key product. These bricks form the basis of most of the polychrome brickwork that was widely used in Melbourne 1880s boom era. This company was the dominant manufacturer of the hawthorn black bricks that helped define the building boom of marvellous Melbourne in the 1860s to the 1880s period. The black hawthorn bricks were as important as bluestone in providing a distinctive regional identity to 19th century Melbourne. Mr. Lewis has been doing heritage work since the 1970s and is very highly regarded in the heritage world. It might interest the councillors to know that Nigel gave evidence recently for the council about a significant graded property in Broadway, Camberwell. The outcome was a win at VCAT. The council's heritage consultant, Nashika Schmader from GML, in her report agrees with Nigel. I quote from her report, I agree that the hawthorn black bricks produced at these brickworks were extremely important for late 19th century architecture in the Melbourne metropolitan area. They are known as hawthorn bricks, and their importance in late Victorian era architecture is recognised by those in the heritage profession. In her conclusion in her report, she goes on to say, I agree with Mr. Lewis that the principal period of importance of the hawthorn brickworks was the late 19th century, and particularly the 1880s due to their production of hawthorn black bricks, though the brickworks remained an important source of material for Melbourne's buildings over the subsequent decades. I also agree with Mr. Lewis that if this was recognised as the key period of development, then the mid to 1880s development of Rosebery Street would be of such significance in illustrating this period that at least part of the street could contribute to this theme despite its lower level of overall integrity than seen in the streetscapes currently in the HO 841 Brickfields Environ Precinct.
Thank you.
I ask that council continues to work.
If you can just wrap up after this sentence, Ms. Muirden. Thank you.
Continues to work on the historical significance of the Fritz Holzer Park and working to protect the site of the former brickworks. We also ask that the resident group and the Burundara Heritage Group have a meeting with councillors and planners to discuss several issues in the reports relating to the Fritz Holzer brickworks and Rosebery Street. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Muirden. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms. Muirden this evening? There appears to be no questions. Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, we'll move on to our third presenter, Mr. Darren Simcox. And after Mr. Simcox, we'll hear from Ms. Christina Brannigan.
Hello?
Hello, Mr. Simcox.
Yes, hello.
That's why if we can just commence with your name and your suburb, followed by your presentation.
Darren Simcox here. I'm a resident of Rosebery Street in Hawthorn East. I unfortunately don't support the councillor's motion at the moment and want to look further.
Mr. Simcox, sorry, if I could just, if you could just speak up nice and loud because you're a little bit soft there. Thank you.
A little bit soft. Okay. We'll try to do that. Sorry, I'll just.
That's better.
Yep. Okay. And you got my name and everything? Yes?
We do.
Okay. Look, councillors, when we had last addressed the meeting, we were asked to bring something more to the table, something highly historical and linking the brickwork, something you could work with to help us save the street and the heritage. I bring your attention to the Charles Cook painting on the screen, the 1885 and a lithography of 1888. We've had a Hawthorn Historical Society examine this and agreed by Nigel Lewis. It's covered in his in the resident funded report to you. Yet it was passed over by Council Heritage. It shows the position of Rosebery Street to be in the foreground. There's an entry into brickworks on the corner of Rosebery and Campbell Road down in the left-hand corner. There's mine carts using dirt strip, which will become Rosebery Street in the future, to move clay and bricks down to the pits. And a single cottage, well, it's still standing and it matches up with the maps as number 92. High integrity, yet just contributory. So, yes, it's a blue colour wooden workers' cottage, which are underrepresented on any heritage list. Yet they have stood for over 140 years. Blue collar history is not recorded the same way as grand heritage homes. Plans, documents, etc. are harder to find. We need time. Rosebery Street reads as a Victorian street with timber workers' cottages which are built in the 1880s before houses in the majority of the precinct. The timber houses were used by workers in the early days of the brickworks. Some were early established William Street brickworks, and we have brought you some of those historical links. Although built during the 1890s depression, it's testament to the craftsmanship and that so many of these timber workers' cottages still survive 150 years later. Context Heritage have commented at last meeting that Victorian cottages are already well represented in the meeting. Yet the new report is suggesting that they'll be hard to include without redefining this citation. For example, if I show you a table, I believe I've provided it for you, there's 7 streets currently in the Brickfield precinct. There's 30 single-fronted weatherboard houses overall in those 7 streets. Rosebery's got 25 single-fronted Victorian examples of these, many of which are absolute architectural features. So I don't see why there's red tape in bringing them into the citation. Rosebery Street, Rosebery Street offers 19 weatherboard, 1 brick double-fronted, 25 weatherboard, 4 single-fronted Victorian houses for inclusion in the precinct. By contrast, only Aberdeen and Caroline Street have comparable Victorian properties, but significant less quality. 3 double front and 10 single front in Aberdeen. There is much less representation of blue-collar Victorian worker cottages in the rest of the precinct. So how hard is it to bring these gems into the modern era? Well, we don't live in simple lives anymore. So the upper stories on the little cottage are little in themselves. Many blocks are only 6 metres wide, and with planning guidelines, you end up with a 3x3 room on top. Not easy to make unobtrusive, as the big heritage homesteads that are prominent around Burundar. So maybe we need to look at that.
Mr. Simcox, it's in 3 minutes. If you can just wrap up with one final sentence.
Okay. It's incumbent on Council, by law and statutory requirement that we continuously work to protect heritage. Please help us do it for the Brickwork site and Rosebery Street.
Thank you, Mr. Simcox. And Governance, if we could just drop that off the screen so I can see if there are any questions for Mr. Simcox. Council, is there any questions? There are no questions this evening, Mr. Simcox. Thank you very much for your presentation. So our next speaker is Miss Christina Brannigan, and that will be followed by Mr. Brock Ubergang. Are you there, Miss Brannigan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Fantastic. And see you. Thank you, Ms. Brannigan. If we can commence with your name and your suburb and your presentation. Thank you.
Sure. I'm Christina Brannigan from Camberwell. Thank you, Council, for your work, and especially to Councillors Gillis and Bigger. The community believe that if we follow the officer's recommendation, that we're going to risk walking away from protecting a very important part of Burundara and Melbourne's history. It's much clearer now than it was a few months ago that, in actual fact, this street and the brickworks is even more significant than was recognised before. So after all the work, if we actually look at the reports of all the consultants, we're much closer to a solution than we were 3 months ago. So please, let's not walk away today. There are 50 heritage houses on that street, and the work undertaken by Council's consultants does provide us with a solution. It's there in the detail. And Nigel Lewis in his report clearly states that he believes the street should be included in the precinct. We're very concerned that his and Gary Vine's evidence has largely been set aside and ignored and not given equal weight to that of Council's consultants. They are hugely experienced heritage consultants with over 30 years experience. Mr. Lewis has also told us this week that he disagrees that the precinct could not be rewritten so that the houses of the post-19th century era could be included. He doesn't believe that there would be a loss. He also proposes quite strongly to council that one of the key solutions, if they do think that's a risk, is to protect the Fritz Holzer Park because of its huge significance to Melbourne's history. So to quote Nigel Lewis, without the brickworks, there would be no Victorian Melbourne as we know it. He also says in his report, as Nerida has pointed out, that the black bricks were so significant to Melbourne's visual identity, which is agreed by Ms. Schrader also. In his report, Nigel Lewis says he believes that Rosebery Street can be included in the overlay, and he suggests how to approach it. For example, he says that the extent and context reviews do not appear to have considered the importance of Fritz Holzer in the pre-1903 period, nor the relationship of Rosebery Street with the Fritz Holzer clay pit. He says there is a strong case for 1 to 83 and 2 to 70 Rosebery Street to be added to the Brickfields precinct. Further, Ms. Schmieder and Mr. Lewis agreed that if the precinct citation were to be altered, that it would be possible for Rosebery Street to emerge as an important street. Ms. Schmieder says, as I think Nerida pointed out, she actually, I quote her, she says, "I agree with Mr. Lewis that if this was recognised as a key period of development, then the mid-1880s development of Rosebery Street would be of such significance in illustrating the period that at least part of the street could contribute to the theme." Further, as a key solution, Mr. Lewis proposes that the site of the old brickworks should be placed in the heritage overlay.
30 seconds.
Ms. Schmieder would appear, we believe, to be proposing serious consideration of heritage protection of the park, or at least looking into it. That is actually really the undercurrent, we believe, in what she's saying in the report. Yet, despite all of this, the proposal before us tonight is to do nothing. Mr. Lewis disputes the claim that some of the post-19th century houses would need to be at risk if we rewrote the precinct.
Ms. Brannigan, that's your 3 minutes. If you can just wrap up very quickly, please.
That he does not accept that this is the case, and so we ask tonight that further consideration is given to all the new evidence and more time set aside, that we at least ask Mr. Lewis for a response and ask GML perhaps to attempt to draft a new precinct citation, and that we seriously look at protecting the Fritz Holzer Park as a key solution. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ms. Brannigan. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms. Brannigan? With your indulgence, councillors, I do have a question myself. Ms. Brannigan, obviously we heard from Mr. Costello earlier about, obviously, if council were to pursue reviewing the current precinct statement to include the Brickfields estate, that it may have potential ramifications in other parts of the current precinct. How do we reconcile that if we were to go down that line?
I think if we look at Nigel Lewis's report, he gives us some indications as to what we need to do. So he talks about the importance of the brickworks itself. So one of the solutions is actually to protect the brickworks. He actually says that the brickwork site should have much stronger protection and should be in the heritage overlay, and that in actual fact that becomes a key to unlocking, to enabling more protection of 19th century houses, and therefore that would mean that Rosebery Street becomes much more significant. And in fact, that is what Natica Schmieder, I believe, is saying too. In second part, in answer to your question, Gary, is that he actually says, he hasn't had time to respond to us properly because we've only had a week since we've seen the report, but he sent us an email this week saying that he refutes and doesn't agree, in actual fact, that even if the park weren't protected, he doesn't agree that the post-19th century houses would all be at risk of not being protected. And further, I would also say that council has a great deal of experience of doing precinct extensions at a later stage after having done initial protection work. So this isn't a new situation that we might consider in the future, altering a precinct. And surely we could get some support from some of these experts to work out how to do it. I don't believe we've explored every avenue.
Thank you, Ms. Brannigan. Councillors, are there any further questions of Ms. Brannigan? There being none, thank you for your presentation again, Ms. Brannigan, this evening. So our next presenter, councillors, excuse me, is Mr. Brock Ubergang, who I believe has a presentation which will show on the screen, followed by Mr. David Haddock afterwards. Mr. Ubergang, thank you for joining us. And I believe you've got a presentation which governance will put up on the screen. We just can't hear you at the moment, Mr. Ubergang. No, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Governance, what we might do is we might come back to Mr. Ubergang and move on to our next presenter, and hopefully we'll be able to resolve your audio issues in the meantime. So we'll come back to you again, Mr. Ubergang. Oh, actually, try again.
Have you got me now?
We have. Fantastic.
Okay.
Good.
Great. Sorry
Excellent.
about that.
So if we can start with your name and your suburb, and I believe officers will put up a presentation at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah. So Brock Ubergang from Rosebery Street, and I actually support the submission by council not to continue with the heritage listing for Rosebery Street. Firstly, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Boroondara City Council for their consultative process that it's been undertaken since the community nomination was lodged by interested community members to include Rosebery Street, Hawthorn East. I won't indulge you with what I spoke about on the 8th of November, but it's fair to say that there's been a lot of change to Rosebery Street that has moved the intactness away from what we're trying to achieve. All I did want to say is that there's been numerous assessments undertaken of Rosebery Street in the last 5 years by 4 heritage consultants. Each have come back with the same result. I do note that GML has indicated if there is a change in citation and strategic basis for the existing brickfields in Byron's precinct, the inclusion of some unknown properties could be considered. And it also indicates that there is potentially some unknown number of properties that would be at risk as well. It seems like there's a lot of unknowns here that we want to look at continuing with if we were to continue down this path. I do note that we've also asked for more time. When we had this discussion on the 8th of November, it was set aside for that particular reason, to undertake more time to assess what's there. There's been 4 months since that's occurred. I'm wondering how much more time is required before we can come to a result. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ubergang. Councillors, are there any questions of our presenter? There being none, thank you again for your presentation this evening. So we'll move on to our next presenter, who is Mr. David Haddock, followed by Miss Christine Butler.
Through you, Chair. Mr. Haddock isn't online at the moment. You might want to move to the next presenter.
We'll come. Thank you for that. Miss Christine Butler. Hello, Miss Butler. Good evening.
Good evening.
That's right. If we can just commence with your name and suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Christine Butler, I'm in Rosebery Street and I do not support. I hope that you have all read the reports, especially our report from Nigel Lewis and the Council's report from Natica Schmeder, GML. We all agree that Rosebery Street is not as intact as other streets appear, but it does still have a higher percentage of heritage homes than streets in the precinct, especially on the northern side. Time has not been kind to the south side. Again, this is all part of history and development. A street backs onto a quarry, houses are lost due to subsidence and its proximity. Quarry, after it's used by date, has to be filled in. Council takes over the area, uses it to bury its council waste. Not great for houses backing onto it. The council takes over this land and eventually new housing comes along. But please, this does not justify demolishing the history still on display on the north side of the street. The initial reports from Council's consultants concluded that the Fritz and Holzer families had no connection with Rosebery Street. They have now been provided with documentation from the Historical Society that the Holzer families owned and lived in Rosebery Street, information on electoral rolls and postal directories. Your consultants talked about the intrusion of second-storey additions in Rosebery Street that can be viewed from the street. We possibly agree with that too, but if you walk the streets included in the Brickfield precinct, you will note that this has happened in other streets. If I count the number of heritage houses in those streets compared to the total number of houses in our street, Rosebery Street has a far higher percentage than at least 3 of those streets, a factor that hasn't come into the equation by council. As I said, if you've all read the reports from council, then you also have read the reports from the eminently experienced heritage consultants Nigel Lewis and Natica Schmeder that we have mentioned before. You'll have noted that both these consultants agree with the importance of Rosebery Street to the Fitzholzer brickworks of the late 19th century. Without the brickworks development in this area, without the brickworks development of this area, we would be in a very different world, and we would not be here discussing these homes. It's the brickworks that made the whole environment here what it is. It is also agreed that Rosebery Street architecturally is just as important as the streets in the Brickfields precinct, with a wide variety of styles from the late 18th century and interwar.
30 seconds, Ms Butler.
Okay, I asked the council not to close the gate on preserving the heritage of our street, but to find a way to protect Rosebery Street in accordance with 2 of the 3 heritage consultants that we've already covered tonight. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Ms Butler, and spot on for timing, by the way. Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Butler? There being no questions, thank you again, Ms Butler, for your presentation this evening. I'll call for our next presenter, Mr Rick Johnson, followed by Mr Richard Arbon. Good evening, Mr Johnson.
Good evening, can you hear me?
We can, thank you very much for that. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is Rick Johnson. I live in Rosebery Street in Hawthorn East. Thanks for the opportunity to talk tonight. I am in support of the council officer's recommendations. I'd like to reiterate the fact that of the 92 properties in Rosebery Street, only a handful of residents have felt strongly enough about this issue to put up signs advocating their support. There are less than a dozen residents who actually want this overlay. The term community nomination I don't feel is appropriate. Most of the houses displaying signs are not contributory and generally have been extended and modified out of the character required. These people don't practice what they preach, but rather want to control what other people want to do. Less than a dozen signs, and yet here we are spending time, effort, and ratepayers' money on the demands of a dozen people. I question whether the wider Boroondara rate-paying community would support this spending of valuable dollars if they knew what was going on here. This money would be much better spent on community resources, such as our beautiful Fitzholzer Park, a resource that benefits thousands of Boroondara ratepayers and others. Also, at a time when many in the community are suffering the financial burdens of a pandemic, we are wasting council money on reports. I'm sure if we continue to pay for reports, we will eventually get one that supports the proposal. But at what cost? Can we please stop wasting ratepayers' money on the whims of a handful of people? In summary, I would respectfully request that the Urban Planning Delegate Committee stand up for the silent majority of Rosebery Street residents and follow the recommendations of these expert reports. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr Johnson. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Johnson this evening? Yes, we do, from Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Mr Johnson, you mentioned that only a few houses on Rosebery Street had signs up in support of this particular initiative to have heritage citation over all of Rosebery Street. Now, this is a curiosity question only. If you can't tell me that, that's fine. But if you could just give me a sense of, in the whole street, how many houses would have signs out supporting and who wouldn't, if you wouldn't mind.
As I said, I believe there's less than a dozen. There's somewhere between 10 and 12. Some have them set back on their properties and some on their front fences.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillors, any further questions? There being none, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your presentation this evening. So return to Mr. Richard Arbon as our second last presenter. Good evening, Mr. Arbon.
Hi.
That's right. If we can just commence with your name, your suburb, and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Council Thompson for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Mr. Arbon, if you could just speak nice and loud into that microphone. You're a little bit soft on our end. Thank you.
Look, I'd like to speak about two things tonight, but I actually just wanted to take issue with the previous speaker's comment that a very small percentage of people in the street actually have been seeking protection. My understanding is that around about half the street wrote last year. I have that on very good authority, so I think he's actually being inaccurate there. And I sort of want to go on to talk about something that's kind of related to that. I'd like to speak about two things, about the number of people who have actually asked you to find a solution to protecting the street, and also how important historical places are to people. So let's look at the fact that over 1,000 people petitioned council in just 2 weeks via an online petition set up late last year. 1,000 people, so that's a lot larger than the number just given to us by that previous gentleman. So whilst those in public life may of course be used to petitions, we'd like you to think about these 1,000 individual people and the fact that they're each saying to you that they think these houses are important to Melbourne's history, to Hawthorn's character, and to Boroondara. People don't generally sign petitions for no reason. Signing a petition is generally the sign that people want to be heard. If they're able to be in the council chamber tonight and outside in the foyer, I guess that crowd of 1,000 would be a big crowd and probably pretty noisy. Please take note of the really strong value many people in Hawthorn, Camberwell, Canterbury, Surrey Hills, Kew and all these older suburbs of Boroondara place on local history. We know councillors are aware of this, but at times resident voices can be sidelined in the melee of planning decisions and, in inverted commas, expert advice. And people are right to place so much importance on these houses. The architecture is special, the environment they provide is special, and it's special for all of Melbourne, especially as there are very few worker cottages in Hawthorn East with a history tied to a very important brickworks. All societies proud of their heritage protect important and aesthetically pleasing historical places and historical items. They give us a sense of who we are, where we came from, and they help centre us. But protection is often not automatic, particularly where there is much pressure to give way to the new and to development. These houses are 140 years old. They're markers of a past time that shaped the past and future of Melbourne, and they're linked to the endeavours and work of those who shaped and built this city. Please look more closely at the report of your consultants and see your way to saving these places. Otherwise, they will surely be gone in the next 10 to 20 years, or at least many of them will. And once they're gone forever, which means that future generations will be denied an important reference point to the history of this area and denied the special environment they create. All the 300, 400, 500 plus year old places we see when we travel overseas were protected by some people in the community at some point, or by a council with foresight, thinking about the next generations and deciding to keep protecting them. But they too, once upon a time, were 140 years old. 1,000 people who signed this petition are asking you to protect this area now and for future generations. And as we all know, these 1,000 people are just the tip of the iceberg. The crescendo of voices in Boroondara is increasing, asking for more protection and less rampant development. And I think you need to take heed of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arbon. Spot on 3 minutes again. Thank you. Councillors, any questions of Mr. Arbon? There have been no questions. Thank you for your presentation again to us this evening. So, Governance, we might just return back to Mr. David Haddock if he is online.
Through you, Chair, Mr. Haddock isn't online.
Makes for a very short presentation. Thank you, Governance. So we'll turn to matters arising, Mr. Costello, from the presenters this evening.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just go through some matters that have been raised just briefly. The first one is in relation to the requirement to need more time on this. As we know, this was a subject of a petition partway through last year. This is the third time this has been considered, and the first report considered last year found no justification This current report also finds no justification, albeit GML highlight that there could be the potential based on the claims being made by Mr. Lewis. It's claimed that there is no requirement for extra time. In relation to the protection of Fritz Holzer Park, the Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study in 2018 notes Fritz Holzer Park and that it does have heritage significance. It is also a council-owned asset. So it doesn't need to be in a heritage overlay. It's not under any threat from private landowners. It is also as a result of the methodology which has been adopted throughout the life of the municipal-wide heritage gap study, that any council-owned site identified as having potential heritage significance is placed on our own internal council heritage database, which would have the effect of triggering referrals from other departments within council that would seek to carry out works in the park. And that's pretty standard practice across many of our parks that might have heritage value, where a particular part of council would be seeking to carry out works. They would trigger a referral to our department for an assessment of heritage significance at that time. The Fritz Holzer Park is on that database, and it was put on that database because it is already flagged in the Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study, which was drafted back in 2018. It is still in the adopted Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study today, which has been gazetted last year. In relation to the points from Ms. Muirden, I do agree that the point made by Mr. Lewis is that he does seek to reinforce the key period of the late 19th century as justification for including Rosebery Street properties in the heritage overlay, to the point where they would actually, where that claim would actually override the level of intactness of the street itself in terms of the built form that is being sought for protection. In relation to that level of evidence, that would obviously need to be tested significantly through any kind of planning scheme amendment process, including by an independent planning panel, about whether that level of justification for including Rosebery Street in the heritage overlay is appropriate. And also in relation to the Brickfields Environs precinct, the elevation of the level of importance of the Hawthorne black bricks was not relied upon as justification to include the Brickfields Environs precinct in the heritage overlay. The Brickfields Environs precinct spans the full life of the brickworks, everything from Edwardian through to interwar, and it is on that basis that we proceeded. It is also noted at the time that Rosebery Street was assessed as part of the Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study, and it was assessed for inclusion in this precinct, and it was found that it was not strategically justifiable and was subsequently dropped. In relation to the points raised by Mr. Simcox, it is useful information he provided on the number and quantum of properties. However, I do note that there's been that the trigger for the community nomination was subsequent demolition, which has occurred in Rosebery Street, following to the earlier assessment in 2018, which again reinforced that there was no strategic justification at that time. In relation to the points raised about precinct extensions, precinct extensions are not new. They have been implemented through multiple heritage studies, including the Heritage Gap Study. The difference here is, of course, that in most precinct extensions don't require the existing citation for the substantive precinct to be rewritten in order to justify the inclusion of the extension. A precinct extension is typically formulated on the basis of the citation for the substantive precinct being sufficient justification to extend it to include additional properties. The claim being made by Mr. Lewis is that the citation would effectively need to be rewritten to shift the emphasis towards a particular era of development, which would then seek to then bring in properties in Rosebery Street, given that that was not a particular point of strategic intent at the time. That is not necessarily a logical precinct extension. In relation to the link to the brickworks, as mentioned by Ms. Butler, that has already been well canvassed through the life of this assessment process, including the earlier report, the report last year, and the advice included in this report. And finally, in relation to the points raised by Mr. Arbon in relation to the reliance on expert advice in these matters. And this is a fairly important point, because ultimately, as officers, when we run a process to include properties in a heritage overlay, we rely on professionals, because ultimately it is the professionals, the heritage consultant, that will be called upon as an expert witness at a panel hearing. And at a panel hearing, when evidence is being tested, both for and against, it is that professional advice that is ultimately paramount in the consideration of these matters. It is also important to recognise that whilst community members may hold a level of attachment to their environments and to their streets and their places, which is entirely understandable, ultimately heritage controls are measured against the requirements of a planning practice note released by the Minister for Planning, and that ultimately it will be the advice of an independent panel and finally the decision of the Minister that will determine whether any properties in Rosebery Street go into a heritage overlay, and that will ultimately be based on professional advice. Those are the only items I have to this point, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? I can see Councillor Gillies' hand is up, and followed by Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Costello. I know this is a massively big project and you and other officers have put a huge amount of time into it. Chair, at this point, I do not have a question, but I would like to foreshadow a motion, please.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Councillor Watson, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have two questions. I have three questions, but I suspect the third one maybe have to be taken on notice. So, Mr. Costello, have we, if I remember correctly, we've spent about 2 years to get this far. Is that correct, or has it been longer?
It's been longer. The Hawthorn East Heritage Gap Study was initially drafted in 2018.
All right. So could you tell me how much we've spent so far on this particular gap study?
We are around nearly 1.2 million, I believe.
On the Hawthorn study or all gap studies?
The entirety of the contract. In relation to the Hawthorn East Heritage Gap Study, I'll need to take that on notice. I don't have the figure in front of me.
Okay, so 1.2 million is the overall figure. So again, you might not be able to answer these next two questions, but how much, if we were to rescope an investigation, how long would this take us to complete?
We believe it will be about 3 months, because it would require the appointment of another heritage consultant or a heritage consultant to go and effectively restudy the entire thing, look at the impact on a citation, and ultimately potentially draft a statement of significance that would ultimately be form the basis of a planning scheme amendment, particularly with our own time frame, which ultimately would lead us to somewhere in the order of 3 months.
So, Mr. Costello, would that include consulting with residents if things are identified as needing to be changed? Is that go to woe, or is that just how long the new heritage expert would take to redo their stuff?
So, Mr. Costello, I just noticed hands come up from Mr. Wilmson and also Mr. Cohen. I'm not sure. Mr. Wilmson, you put your hand up first. Did you want to respond to that question or the previous question?
I might attempt to actually answer both of those at the same time. Yes, we won't be able to tell you the exact figure how much we spend on the Hawthorn East study off the bat, but I think it would be fair to say that with the cost of exhibition, with the cost of engaging the experts through the panel process, the legal representation that we engage for the panel, we're probably looking at the order of 75 to 100K for the gap study itself. That's the implementation phase plus the cost associated with the actual preparation of the study. from early 2018 onwards. So I think overall the budget initially was about $250,000 for each of the gap studies. So that's the order of money that we're looking at having spent at the moment already up to this point. Looking forward, if we were to undertake an assessment here, we think that an initial assessment would probably be in around the $10,000 mark. And if it were to lead to an amendment, we would probably be looking at overall cost of about $50,000, if not more. That includes the exhibition, engaging the consultant to be part of the exhibition process through expert witness, getting legal representation, the panel fees and statutory costs associated with that as well. That time frame from where to go now to the end, if we were talking about the amendment process, you'd probably be looking at 2 years process as well. And that would involve consultation along the way as well. And that would not just be consultation with the owners in Rosebery Street or property owners in Rosebery Street, but would include all the owners of every property within the precinct that exists at the moment.
Oh, okay. Can I just sum that up to make sure that I've heard all that correctly? So, if we embark on a new process, there's another 2 years. You think it'll cost in excess of 50,000, or over the entire 2 year span, we're looking at another 100,000. Could you just clear that up for me? I'm not quite sure exactly. Yeah. There are a lot of numbers there. So 2 years to do it again. I get that bit. How much would it cost?
We would estimate probably around $50,000.
All right. So 2 years and $50,000 to redo it all, in your estimation.
Yes, with no guarantee of what the outcome will be.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I did notice Councillor Stavrou had his hand up, and I'll take note of Councillor Hollingsworth to follow.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Look, I'm a little bit, perhaps a little bit confused, and I'll ask the first question. Hopefully, it'll unwind that confusion. It's not obvious to me why emphasising part of the history as the important part of the history of the brickworks would actually detract from previously established places. I mean, the way that I understand it is that that part directly relates to some of the properties that are contributed in Rosebery Street. And to me, that's just an addendum, but enlighten me, please.
I think the main concern here is also that Mr. Lewis makes the claim that the importance of the Hawthorn black bricks and the particular era they were built in would reach such a level of importance from a heritage perspective that they would actually be of greater importance than that it would actually override the intactness of the street itself. So obviously, if it requires that level of justification to include these properties, then there's implications for the other properties in the precinct that are not of that era, given the level of reliance he is placing on this era to justify the properties in Rosebery Street being included. So there was no reliance on this through the life of the Brickfields Environs precinct. It was everything from Edwardian through to interwar. So Mr. Lewis makes the claim that in order to justify Rosebery Street being included, that you need to rely on the importance of, you need to establish a level of importance in the late 19th century era. That is not necessarily in addition to the existing precinct justification.
Councillor Stavrou?
But as a follow-up, it appeared to me from reading all the consultants, those that were supporting, you know, a relook, and those that are saying no, that everything has been reviewed, they all agreed on that importance of the Hawthorn brick and its importance in Victoria's history. So that kind of says to me that that's already been taken into account in actually looking at the overall site, the overall process over many years, where waves of workers and building and different styles and renovations have occurred. And it's only saying that it reached a crescendo at that part, which is not, it wasn't negated by anybody. So I didn't read it necessarily that way.
Very fair. Christian?
Yep. Mr. Williamson.
I think, through Mr. Chair, I think if we try and get a metaphor going, if we look at it on a balancing scale, at the moment, the heritage citation for the precinct affords equal importance to the lifespan of the entire brickworks. And so everything that's associated with within that period of frame has more or less equal value, and that's reflected in the gradings of the buildings. And where you've got non-contributors, either because they were built much later, they were demolished, or the extent of changes made to those buildings has been so great. What the new argument is that because of the significance of this short period when the Hawthorn black brickworks, sorry, that's a bit of a tongue twister, the Hawthorn black bricks were manufactured in that facility, you kind of need to devalue you need to raise the level as it is expressed in the citation and the reasons for its assessment. You need to elevate that. And by that nature, everything else comes down a notch. And that becomes then the critical point. At what point is everything else devalued to the point where buildings that now, from the Edwardian and interwar period, don't have that association with that key phase anymore, and that they're downgraded and potentially fall under the threshold of being graded contributory, and therefore falling out of the precinct or undermining the precinct as a whole. I think if you think of it that way, then that's probably the critical bit that we've taken away, and also from the discussions that we've had with Ms. Schmieder on this issue. So it's not just a matter of rewriting, it's actually totally refocusing the citation and the basis for inclusion in the heritage overlay.
Does that assist Councillor Stavrou?
Well, maybe if you indulge me with one minor clarification.
Sure.
Sorry, Mr. Wilson, would it also be, I guess, a rational way to think of it as the tide lifts all boats, that just because we lift this period, it may lift the overall importance of everybody else rather than actually lifting this at the expense of others? That's another way of looking at it.
If you, through the life of the gap study, in the way that precincts and buildings have been graded, has always been, or one of the key factors in determining whether a building is contributory or not contributory in the first instance is it from the key phases of development and the important phases of development. And if you don't meet that threshold, then you don't almost even get to the question of, is the building intact enough to warrant a contributory grading or being non-contributory. So if you think of it of a series of little tests that have to be run, then that first test almost already falters at that step. I'm not a heritage expert, so I can't tell you with 100% certainty to say that well, it means that every Edwardian or every interwar building within the precinct might come down. It might actually be whatever the outcome would be of that assessment. No one has undertaken that assessment, obviously, at this point in time. For Ms. Schmieder, that was not part of the scope of the work. And Mr. Nigel Lewis, maybe instructively, also hasn't gone and done that work. He's just said this is the way to do it, but he hasn't answered that next step in the question, which probably would have been helpful if that had been done. But that's where we find ourselves in making a decision at the moment. And from officer perspective, we just don't feel that the risk is worth to try and answer those questions, given the process that we've run to date.
Thanks, Councillor Stavrou. I'll go to Councillor Hollingsworth, and I'll note Councillor Biggie, you have a question as well.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Wilson, I'm struggling to understand why this particular precinct had limitations with the citation of the houses of the late Victorian, and why those that are Victorian and Edwardian weren't afforded the same weight. It just seems to be, different criteria to other heritage overlay gap studies that have been implemented. And in particular, I'm surprised with number 92 that it's now 140 years old and still in its original intactness form, of whether or not that would perhaps potentially now even be upgraded to significance. So following on from what Councillor Stavrou said, I hear what you're saying. I'm listening to what everyone has said tonight. But I do wonder now, when we're in 2022, if there was the appetite to revisit this and explore the opportunity of expanding the citation to at the least consider some of these properties. There are several sections, as we know, that are still largely intact, and certainly the end that we call the cul-de-sac that still has the original homes there. I personally see that, you know, for every argument, there's the counter argument to it that might justify proceeding with this. But the other thought that came to mind when we've talked about the production of the black brick was, you know, one of the most significant and unique attributes to the citation. There's no production if there isn't people, and it's the people that lived in these homes, that worked in the factory, that were the production, that enabled the production of the brick. And it's not just about bricks,
Councillor
it's
Holmesworth,
bricks also.
sorry, do you have a question of the officers there?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Holmesworth. Councillor Bigger.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a couple of questions, but I'm trying to understand. So we've talked about the importance of the 19th century, which you, I can't recall. I think it was you, Mr. Costello, who was saying that, describing it as a claim by Mr. Lewis. But I might be remembering this wrong, but I thought that Ms. Schmader supported that claim, that she actually agreed that it was that the late 19th century was likely to be the most important time period. Am I correct? I'm just wanting a clarification.
Yeah, she does make that point in her advice. And I guess it's the question of, is that strategically justifiable to bring in extra properties in Rosebery Street? That needs to be fully tested. If that is deemed to be the case, that needs to be fully tested through an amendment. And it also requires us to update the citation to give that emphasis. That emphasis does not exist at this point, and was not the basis for that precinct to be included in the heritage overlay.
Yeah, I hear that. Thank you. But so now we do have. You're confirming though that both Nigel Lewis and Schmader, sorry, stumbling, have both agreed to that point. So it sounds to me, and I want to see if I'm getting this right, that there are two things that you've particularly focused on here as being issues. One is, you say, is the risk. And it sounds to me like that is a risk that we don't quite understand fully. Yeah, we don't know whether it's a small risk to a few properties or a big risk to lots of properties. And you've also raised the issue of the money. So, and again, that from Councillor Watson's questions, you said to go the full length. If we were to go the full length of another citation, we could be talking about 2 years and up to $50,000. Is that correct? But if we were to just explore the question of the risk, would that also be $50,000, or would that be meaning to find out how much of a risk is this? I presume that would be a smaller piece of work, and Mr. Lewis has obviously done some of this research. Is that right? Or
can I just get a clarification as officers respond to Councillor Bigger's question there about whether the citation's 50,000, or is it the citation and the amendment is 50,000? Because my understanding was the citation to review is about 10,000. If we can just clarify that, please.
Yes.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we estimate about $10,000 for the initial assessment now to determine what the risk would be to the existing precinct if it were to be rewritten and reassessed on the basis of the criteria that Mr. Lewis identified in his evidence, and then the additional money would obviously be for the implementation phase through a planning scheme amendment if it got to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So it sounds like it's $10,000 in 3 months or $50,000 in 2 years potentially. This is all a bit of ballpark and a bit of a range, but it is helpful, though. Presumably, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, obviously the money is not everything here, but that's been really helpful for clarifying. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Are there any other further questions from councillors? Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair, and you'll have to excuse me for not making a speech, but rather just asking a question, as we're supposed to do in question time. My question is quite simple. Of the officers who've spoken about cost, are those costs taking into account the cost of staff and resources internally as well as external costs, or not?
They don't account for staffing costs. That would just be costs to be paid to consultants, legal representation, statutory fees, and the cost of the panel hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Park. We have a further question from Councillor Watson. Follow up?
Yes, following up on Councillor Park's question, is there any way you could ballpark how much it was going to cost officers the internal time, because that reveals the true cost of this whole exercise?
Putting my math skills on the spot right there and then. I don't know whether I'm really in a position to estimate that. I think over the life of the project, you would probably estimate, going through peaks and troughs, maybe 1 to 1.5 days on a weekly basis for an officer to deal with this. It'll obviously rise during the exhibition periods and the panel hearing process, and it's a bit quiet in between, plus the time of writing reports. I can't put a figure on that. I don't know whether, David, you want to speculate or Scott, but yeah.
I know it's hard to speculate, but it might assist councillors with an understanding.
Through yourself, Chair, it is extremely hard to speculate, and it's something that that is an exercise that often you can do, is calculate that, but you would have to at least double what's been quoted, I would have thought. Yeah.
Thank you. That assists me greatly.
Thank you, councillors. And I do have a follow-up question from Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. I wasn't going to ask this question, but since Councillor Watson and Councillor Park brought it into play, it would be fair to say, at least in my experience, that in projects like this, there would be contingencies put in internal time for precisely circumstances like this, where a project requires additional internal work. So I would imagine this would come under such a contingency as well. Would that be correct?
Is there a contingency that officer time can come from? Is that your question?
My question was, may I rephrase it?
Yep.
In projects like this, there would always be a contingency associated with scenarios where staff working on a project would need to provide some extra time to address issues that come to pass from time to time, where something is not as self-evident.
Mr. Walker.
Thanks, Chair. Happy to answer that. I wouldn't agree that a contingency would be set aside for a project like this in the way that's been described. What would normally happen is that there would be an expectation, anticipation for a project of what resourcing would be required and what time frame that would take place. And there would be a program put in place of strategic work to be done over a period of time. And I agree there's a small component of ad hoc work would be programmed in. So I do agree there would be a small component of ad hoc work for new things and responses to things that come up over that program. But a significant deviation to a project like this that would result in a new planning scheme amendment would then have a consequence of other projects would need to be delayed to accommodate that capacity given the timing of them. So that would then need to be reset the program of other work and delay other projects that were anticipated in that program.
Thanks, Councillor Stavro. Councillors, are there any further questions of officers? Okay, on that basis, Councillor Gillies, I believe you foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask our admin to please put the alternative motion on the screen?
So this motion, Councillor Gillies, if you could just quickly read that out for the benefit of anyone who hasn't seen this.
Thank you, Chair. This motion reads that the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to 1, defer consideration of the item to enable officers to further explore the risks to existing properties within the Brickfields Environs Precinct associated with revising the precinct, heritage citation and certificate of significance, and 2, prepare a further report for consideration by the UPDC on the outcomes of the heritage consultant's assessment and recommended next steps.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. And if governors can just drop that down so I'm in search of a seconder for that. I've got Councillor Bigger, and to assist Councillor Gillies, councillors, is there any opposition on this item? There appears to be opposition. So Councillor Gillies, as the mover, do you wish to speak to your motion?
I do, thank you, Chair. We all agree with and recognise the importance of preserving our municipality's heritage now and for future generations. Mostly that heritage is represented in built form, but it's also there in stories, cultural significance and identity. It's only right that we acknowledge the work commenced in 2016 of the municipality-wide heritage gap studies. Over 5,500 properties were added to heritage overlays, placing Boroondara as the 3rd highest number of HOs in Victoria. That level of success is fantastic and doesn't come easily. The state government's requirements for heritage have high benchmarks. Requirements and regulations to achieve heritage protection are challenging, much of which Council has limited powers to manoeuvre with. We set out to see if Rosebery Street, or even part of it, could be included in HO 841, the Brickworks Environs Precinct. Whilst the consultant heritage experts have areas on which they agree and disagree, no one disputes that there is good stock of period housing in Rosebery Street. I note in particular the advice from the highly regarded heritage expert, Mr. Gary Vines, and I quote, "The Brickfields Environs Precinct in the heritage overlay is one of these brickworks housing areas described as modest working housing from the late Victorian, Edwardian and interwar eras in the statement of significance. This description applies equally to Rosebery Street houses," end of quote. Within the reports we have before us is the suggestion to revisit the citation and statement of significance for HO 841. This is perhaps our only door we have open to us to genuinely seek heritage protection for this street. Council's heritage consultants, GML Heritage, agrees with many of Mr. Nigel Lewis's and Mr. Gary Vine's points, all of whom are highly regarded and experienced heritage consultants. The suggestion is to give higher significance to the late 19th century period and the importance of the Fritz Holzer brickworks and community linkages. I think we all understand that unfortunately a social history, no matter how strong and appealing it is, isn't sufficient alone to meet the government requirements. However, let us examine this through another lens, and I know it's not without its risks. I understand that revisiting a citation is not something that's been done before, but is that enough reason to not try? Is that sufficient reason to deny the chance to draft a new citation and test it? There is very clear community wish that we should do that. Surely when we have an opportunity to revisit process and hopefully improve it, shouldn't we take that opportunity? Couldn't this case champion how we improve protection processes? To the residents and supporters who've worked so very hard to gather and collate information in support of heritage protection for Rosebery Street, I absolutely acknowledge all you've done and I applaud you. You've brought to light some amazing, significant social history, and for that we can only thank you. To the officers, I know you've put in a lot more time and consideration than what might be reflected in a written report, and I thank them too. I sincerely thank them too. So, Chair, I'd like to foreshadow an item for general business, and I'd like to support this alternative motion before us and commend it to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. I'll take note of your general business item. Are there other councillors seeking to speak? And obviously the seconder, do you wish to reserve your right at this moment?
I would like to reserve it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. So I've got Councillor Watson, followed by Councillor Addis.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard that this process began in 2016, and what we haven't talked about tonight is that when we enter into this process of identifying properties for heritage, it brings a certain level of uncertainty to our residents, and that uncertainty can be very, very stressful. So I look at this motion with more than a degree of horror, that the idea that we are going down a path of potentially inflicting another 2 years of uncertainty on top of the time that we've already spent. Point number one. I also applaud the approach taken by the officers, the very even-handed approach, and note that our process has been tested time and time and time again. It is a process of rigour, and this heritage study at Hawthorne East is by no means the first time we've done it, and I don't think that spending another $10,000 to explore potential risk, another $50,000 for 2 years, which will double to $100,000 of officers' time. And of particular interest to me was the idea that, well, other projects get put on hold. We've spent a lot of money and a lot of time investing in heritage, but we have a whole city to run. And I say enough is enough. We have representation of this particular period that has been captured and has heritage citations on it. I appreciate the passion for Rosebery Street, but also note that there are many people who live outside of Rosebery Street who are applying their lens to this. Not all the residents of Rosebery Street are up for this stuff. So I say that I absolutely do not support this motion, and hope that the officer's recommendation can possibly be considered. Should this motion fail, I'd be delighted to move it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I've got Councillor Addis, followed by Councillor Franco.
Thanks very much, Chair. Look, I'd like to start by acknowledging that the heritage process is really tough for the people involved, but it's tough for people on both sides of the fence, both for those who want it and for those who don't. And over the many years that Council has been doing this, I think what we can rely on is a very rigorous process, that we adopt a standard process to make this fair for everyone and to ensure our community can expect a reliable process and thereby a reliable outcome. But what I'm seeing here is that we're going against this process, that, you know, we keep having another bite at the cherry, and when it doesn't come up with the yes, let's support it, there's a request that we just do another heritage report. So how many times do we have to go down this path, and how much money do we have to spend on something that we're repeatedly being advised by the experts doesn't have legs? And then we get through this whole process and we have to go to the minister. It's not in our hands, the end result of this, it's in the minister's hands. And what happens there? The minister says, gee, you've had, 5 reports, expert reports saying no, and oh yes, you've had 2 or 3 that say yes. I just don't think it's going to get supported. Again, it's about a transparent process that follows standard practice. So in the end, for me, it's the expert view that counts. And yes, we have people who want this, but we also have people who desperately want us to spend this sort of money on our parks and gardens and facilities for the elderly and any number of things. So to keep spending our money on something that I believe we've we've done to death, I think is, for me, it would be unethical to support this when we've had the answer several times over. So I very much support the officer's recommendation, not the one before us. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very torn on this amendment and the proposals before us that Councillor Gillies, the motion that Councillor Gillies has put before us. I don't disagree with anything that Councillor Addis, our Mayor, has said. I took careful note of the questions that Councillor Stavrou asked in the questioning period, as I had the same questions, so it was very helpful to hear him ask those questions. I do understand the issues. It's a very finely balanced one. I'm inclined to support, but as a final one last opportunity to explore the opportunities to support Councillor Gillies in relation to this. But I do see this as a very uphill battle. It's very much with all the various experts that have been presented. It does become a battle of the experts. I do also understand the officer's point of view that they've made. But look, I'll support Councillor Gillies' motion in this instance, but it's a very challenging one. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. I've got a Councillor Sinfield, followed by Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Chair. I preface my comments by saying that I'm not a professional witness on matters of heritage, but I am elected by my community to be their voice in this virtual chamber. So, you know, matters like this are really difficult. I thank the officers for their impartial and professional advice and respect the opposing position of my colleagues. Councillor Addis made some very valid points a moment ago, you know, and it's a really difficult one. But I'm drawn back to the Boroondara Community Plan, and priority theme number 4 relates to neighbourhood character and heritage. We've heard loudly and clearly from our community that they value this and they value our advocacy in this space. The strategic objective of priority theme number 4 is to protect the heritage and respect the character of Boroondara, and while still facilitating appropriate, well-designed development. The strategies that underpin this objective include 4.2, that the history of Boroondara's heritage places are respected and celebrated through community education, and I believe that we have and continue to learn through these studies. The next step is strategy 4.1 to protect these properties if it is possible. Rosebery Street, you know, is challenging. It pulls on your heartstrings. I visited Rosebery Street on my way into the office this evening to remind myself of the charm in the neighbourhood. And I applaud the effort of the Rosebery Street residents, who, so many of whom have put up the heritage green signs on fences, and also to the historians and lovers of heritage who advocate so strongly for the protection of this precinct. Many locals clearly feel that the look and feel of their neighbourhood will be detrimentally affected should these homes not be afforded at least contributory protection. The stories of our local history on the 8th of November remain with me, and I hope that these cottages can be protected so that the visual reminder of our history will remain. Put simply, the state heritage criteria is not in keeping with community expectation. I'm not at all critical of officers nor the report, but there is a mismatch between community expectation and the criteria. Our affection for these homes and homes of this period has increased over time, but the criteria has not changed. I embarked on a similar quest for protection of the Bradford estate, but unfortunately that didn't yield a positive or improved outcome. However, in saying this, with my eyes wide open, but a degree of caution, I will support the initiative again tonight and applaud my colleagues for their tenacity in pushing this further forward and testing it again. It doesn't diminish the professional advice by officers, particularly Mr. Costello, on this matter. So in response to the community activation, I will support the ward councillors, co-councillors who share Rosebery Street And I believe that it is worth further exploring the information highlighted by heritage expert Mr. Nigel Lewis, and we need to be responsive to the community. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Look, I'll be very brief because my fellow councillors have expressed a lot of things that I would like to say. Particularly, Councillor Sinfield was very eloquent in expressing her views, which I share in almost 100%. Councillor Franco spoke well, and I even agree with many of the things that Councillor Addis Watson Park said throughout this process. It's a hard one. The officers have carried themselves magnificently to give us an unbiased report and to be there time and time again with expert advice and bringing together what appears to be such a difficult particular situation in Rosebery Street. Where I come from, and I think that it doesn't make it unethical for me, is that the experts are not 100% in disagreement. They have got the most difficult part to make a decision. They agree in parts, which makes it extremely difficult to make a decision. But given that if we make the decision not to continue, there is no going back. It is upon us to make the decision to support Councillor Gillies' motion and Councillor Biggar's motion to at least give it that next step, which is not going to be a huge process, and hopefully that would give us the added information that we need to make the decision. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. Are there any other councillors seeking to discuss this? Otherwise, I'll move back to the mover of the motion. There appears to be none, so I'll move back to Councillor. Councillor Biggar, have you spoken? You haven't spoken yet, have you?
I have not.
It was a very small hand, so I did see it just for a brief second. Councillor Biggar.
Thank you. And I will try not to go on, because I appreciate that there have been already a number of statements made tonight that I agree with strongly on both sides of this. It is complicated, but there are at least 50 contributory workers' houses on Rosebery Street. I don't think there's ever been any real disagreement about that. Last year, we asked the UPDC for more time to investigate the historical link and to seek further evidence about a possible case made to protect these 50 historical properties. The information, I think, in the report before us tonight, I was going to quote from a few of the quotes of Ms. Schmader, but I don't think I will, because several community members have, as well as other councillors. But it did really sway me that that for her to go back and revisit this and bring another option as the expert based on new evidence, it's a big step. It's rare, and I think it ought to make us sit up and take notice, which is what we're trying to do tonight. I think it's difficult for a heritage advisor to go back and say, well, there might be something else here. In fact, I think there could well be something else here. She does go on, and she notes the risk that our officers have focused on, and obviously this is, I think the motion tonight is to say, well, we need to understand exactly what that risk might be. But given that she's come back with an option, why wouldn't we at least look at a potential redraft of the precinct criteria? And this is what we actually asked her to do. I absolutely understand that residents need a conclusion on this. They want certainty about their home and their street. We need to get this right. We need to not leave key avenues open and untested. I think on council, we often bemoan this system that binds our hands. It's complex and it's rigid. It often gives us little power to protect the places that I think our community wants protected. And we all accept that ultimately this will not be our decision. It will be a panel, and ultimately the minister will decide if it meets the test. But we've asked for expert advice, and we have been provided with an option through that expert advice. So I guess for me, it's not just about Rosebery Street. It's about the many other homes across Burundar that represent this history, this heritage, what drew us to this place in the first place for many of us. I think all of us as councillors, we know from the Burundar Community Plan, as Councillor Sinfield has mentioned, from conversations we all have with residents, from our inboxes each week, we know that our community is asking us to protect this built heritage. So I would hope that we might be able to make Rosebery Street a great example of doing just that. And because of this, I would ask my fellow councillors to consider those 50 workers' homes on Rosebery Street and support Councillor Gillies' motion that we explore this further. So thank you. And thanks for the time, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Before I move back to the mover, last calls for those who haven't spoken. Okay, Councillor Gill or Councillor Park, just in the nick of time. Councillor Park.
You convinced me, Mr. Chair. I was going to remain mute, but I think the key here are the words of Mr. Costello when he said that the professional advice is paramount, and the professional advice given to us not only tonight but on previous occasions has been very clear. It remains so, and this motion seeks to disregard that advice. I found what Rick Johnson had to say pretty much summed up my thoughts. So I'd like to thank him because he saved me repeating those words. I think I actually endorse everything that he said. And so too, I think Councillor Watson's comments really focused on some of the reasons that this motion should not be supported. The fact of the matter is, and let's not get confused about contingencies in projects and the cost of actually paying for officers to spend enormous amounts of time and produce reports and do the administration that's required here. We heard figures of 10,000 and 50,000, and then when that was probed a bit, we heard that, well, it's going to be at least double that when you allocate the internal costs. And I suspect that we wouldn't be so far wrong if we actually tripled those costs. So I suspect we're looking much closer to $150,000 plus. And for those who are in disbelief or think that I'm exaggerating, let's ask for it to be costed, because I'll guarantee you that that amount will be much closer to the actual cost. The council can only achieve so many things within its means. Money is tight. We really don't need to keep going backwards and round in circles. And this has been before us so many times, and we hear the same thing. We'll probably hear the same thing next time. We need more time. This isn't about more time. It's about the fact that the professional advice doesn't actually support what's being sought by a fairly small group of residents. It's time to put this to bed, and I urge councillors to vote against this motion and support the recommendation of officers.
Thank you, Councillor Park. I'll return back to the mover of the motion, Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. I do acknowledge the variety of views expressed by colleagues. However, I would contest that the professional, because I think the professional advice is actually diverse. This is potentially more than a simple financial commitment to one street. This potentially is about a street that is a bit different. Its linkage to the brickworks is unusual, and it's different to many of the other circumstances that we might have seen or reviewed in the past. And I think this is one case that could actually be a catalyst to improve our heritage approach. This can be a test case that could champion how we look at heritage protection, how we go about it. As I say, I acknowledge the diversity of views, and I thank everyone for bringing those views to the mix. I do think, apart from the validity of all the other views I think Councillor Sinfield made one that actually stood out to me, that this is about responding in a different way to how we might have viewed things in the past. This is an angle that's about the government rules and they're out of keeping with community expectations. So we have the potential here for a case study that we could champion. And I remain committed to commending this to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. I'll now put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? I declare that motion carried, councillors. Thank you for that. We'll move on to item 4, general business. Councillor Gillies, you foreshadowed an item of general business.
I did. Thank you, Chair. A question in two parts for officers. Could officers please consider and advise on policy initiatives for the planning scheme that could help protect neighbourhood character that falls outside of heritage overlays? And could officers provide advice on how council could recognise and further secure protection of the Fritz Holzer parklands? Thank you, Chair.
So, do any officers, are they able to answer those, or do you want to take those on notice for a further response to councillors? Mr. Storer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make the observation that when it comes to trying to strengthen protection for the character of our city, it's important to bear in mind the context, which is that the state government is proposing to make planning reforms, changes to our planning system, the intent of which is to actually negate the impact of this council's character statements. So whilst there is a conversation happening right now in this meeting, suggesting that perhaps we should look at how we strengthen control of character, what we know about the state's planning reforms is they intend to actually negate the impact of character statements. So they're heading in the opposite direction. Now, we don't know what the state will do. That's been a proposal which Council has received a report about. I understand there is a bill going into Parliament this week, which will set out at least some of those reforms, so we may well have the answer. It might be wise to wait until we see that bill before we make any commitments to do any further work, because Council may wish to actually take a different direction. So I understand the point that's being made, and we'll be very happy to actually provide some insight, but perhaps it might be best to see what the state's planning reforms propose in the first place.
Thank you, Councillor Storer. Mr. Storer. Councillor Gillies, I'm sure you don't want that, Mr. Storer. Councillor Gillies.
You're demoting him.
Did that satisfy your response?
Thank you. I think it's better that we are well informed with any information and advice that comes through. So thank you, Mr. Storer.
Thank you. And councillors, are there any other items of general business this evening? Thank you. Are there any items of urgent business? Are there any items of confidential business? So this brings us to the end of our business this evening. Before I close the meeting, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us this evening online, and to all of those presenters that have presented to us this evening. Wish you all the best of health and a successful year ahead for all of you. Look forward to this motion coming forward a little bit later on. Declare the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting closed.